Et merci beaucoup de m'accueillir aujourd'hui, surtout pour le séminaire d'ouverture. Et comme c'est sur les satires, il devrait y avoir quand même un aspect un peu ludique à la première séance. Voilà. So, the auction appears frequently in satirical prints in the 18th century, and so I'm going to take you on a journey to discover why this setting was so adaptable to the satire and why it became such a well-oiled machine. The satires were adaptable, they became a recurrent visual trope of satire, even to the point of overuse, a bit like another satirical trope, which is the scale of justice. So it's a little bit anticlimactic, but I'm going to start with a dud, a satire that doesn't really work because it's overcomplicated and messy. But we'll see, we'll start with this idea of overuse. For example, this is a satire on the campaign for the 1835 general election, and it's filled with puns on the name of Oakes, who was a Tory, and he used his considerable wealth to pack the Bury St Edmunds Corporation. And what you see here is on top, you have the figure of the auctioneer that we're going to be talking about today on his rostrum, and he bellows that the highest bidder to be the buyer of what you see here in the scale of justice, the other satirical trope, the closed-packed corporation. But what you can see is that the auctioneer's speech bubble also admits that the auctioneer is also part of the lots. And a caricature at the bottom of the scale of justice is the buyer, who is also James Oakes, the same person as the auctioneer. So here you can see that the satire has become so messy with so much slippage between who is doing what in this presentation that the punchline is sort of missed. The narrative thread to the auction per se becomes tenuous at best. It's just loosely linked to the theme of corruption. And that's going to be my starting point, the fact that this is such an adaptable theme that it is also very often overused. It's going to be used for a wide range of subjects, from parliamentary politics to military defeats. For example, here you have a satire on the 7 Years' War and the French financial difficulties after military and naval disasters. This one is called The Auction Room, or Louis le Petit, a Bankrupt. And it's even going to be used for adultery gossip during the Queen Caroline affair. So undoubtedly, the auction made room for many subjects. It had a high capacity for satire. And its satirical mechanism rested on the fact that it was perceived publicly, if we try to sum up how it worked, the auction was perceived publicly as a highly volatile event that originated in consumer manipulation. So that afforded a multitude of punchlines, surfing on the notions of credit, trust, gullibility, profligacy, as well as the squandering of inheritance and the debasement of taste. So first, I'm going to show you how the recognizable features of the auction, things like the rostrum, the hammer, the lots, the auctioneer, the bidders, the porter and the clerk, how they were employed in a parody of their original function. And I'm going to show you that there were bursts of intense use, for example, at the beginning of the century, because of financial anxiety. You're going to have a burst of satires in the 1710s, from the scandal of the charitable corporation all the way to the South Sea bubble. You're then going to have another burst with political anxiety in the middle of the century, basically from the Pelham government to the 7 Years' War. As some of you know from the world of satires and Dorothy George's introduction to catalogues of prints and drawings in the British Museum, political prints are normally quite easy. They're easier than other to classify chronologically. But even in political satire, we see traditional symbolism and the recurrence of the same theme from age to age. So although I've got a sort of very neat plan according to dates, there's still going to be slippage of themes. And the last period is 1760-1800, what's also called the Golden Age of satirical prints, of graphic satire. And this period is going to extend our knowledge of the contemporary attitude towards the art market per se, because which by then, by the end of the century, it was used as the actual target of the satires. And we'll conclude on the inherent difficulty of using this genre, the satire genre, the combative prints, as evidence of the reputation of auctioneers and auction as a method. And we will compare the satires to the actual records of auction professionals, and we're going to try to see how reliable, how reputable the trade actually was. So first we're going to start with the props and the villains, with a who's who in the auction. The satires all through the century are actually remarkably consistent in the use of props and characters. First thing is that the dramatic staging of an event as an auction was an astute one, because if we look at non-satirical presentations of the auction, we can see that these were events that contained many characters. They were often displayed or happening in circular positions, which is always a plus for a very effective visual effect. And it had very well-defined, clear central characters. So if we start from the right-hand side, you have the auctioneer, you have the clerk, and you have the porter, which are recurring figures in those satires. And of course, you have the multitude of bidders, which enabled a large set of caricatures, whatever the theme was, often divided between the winners and the losers, or the profiteers and the swindled audience, which is extremely adaptable. So let's have a look at those recurring props and characters, starting with the auctioneer as the central one, the prime suspect. He's often represented with a hammer, standing tall in the rostrum. And the satirical prints, in general, are seen as a dense collage of low and high references with allusions to words, images, and places that are often versatile and quite complex. In the case of satirical auction, they tended, however, to be rather transparent, because the auction setting already enabled all those varieties of figures. So the characters are easily identifiable. The props of the auction are employed, of course, in parody, but in very well identifiable original functions. And so the complexity doesn't really come from the setting. It's going to come from the multi-layered disapprobation that surf on notions of speculation, dismantling, profiteering. But the setting is quite transparent. The auctioneer is often conflated with the seller, and he's seen as the executor. The rostrum is often presented as throne-like, especially in this one where the king is the auctioneer. And his hammer knocks down the lots at the rhythm of the bids, and it's reminiscent of the gavel of justice. But in this setting, it's clearly participating in abuse, in infraction. Here you can see the label is, the gavel is labeled royal prerogative. Sorry, the image is very bad. I should have enhanced it. And here this, I can't go back. Doesn't matter. Here at the state auction, the full print is a reference to the dissolution of the parliament by the king in 1784, after he had engineered the dismissal of the Fox North coalition. So really he is the executor of the plot. So the satirical auction clearly functions as the story of a swindle. The dissemination of lots are used to show someone in a position of power, dispersing public good or breaking up heritage. Those props are going to become so identifiable that in later prints they appear as shorthand for the auction itself. For example, here we have a caricature, Pretty Copy, which is a caricature of Isaac Gossett, who was a bibliophile, and you just have the appearance of the hand of the auctioneer with the gavel at the bottom to signify that the place is Lockie's auction room. So it's become a metonymy of the auction, a little bit like some other speculation and gambling satires work. For example, you have the protective case of the lottery will always appearing in the lottery satires, and here you have the Biribi board always appearing in the gambling satires. It really becomes this sort of the satire object. The second figure is the clerk, who appears as the enabler. He's always located below the rostrum of the auctioneer, with his quill and ledger at the ready, and he records changes of ownership. And the very important prop here is the desk. He's seated at this desk, which we should actually call a bureau, meaning this table specifically designed for accounting. It's first used in England for banking offices in the 18th century, which in 1764 the journalist Melchior van Grim coined the term bureaumania, which then became bureaucracy. So it's a satire on the excessive concern with formal processes and a tendency for administrative power, paper records being created. And the clerk, importantly, and very recurringly, he's in all the auction satires, whereas often one could have thought that just the auctioneer is sufficient, but he always appears. The clerk, importantly, is at the center of the auction's data collection. His role in the auction world was to record the bids. This is not the auctioneer's function. He would annotate the master catalogue as the sale progressed. And for example, here you have a Pitt standing in for this clerk. This is the actual scribal record that a clerk would have produced during an auction. So this scribal culture in practice, you can see it keeps track on information that was not made public during the sale. For example, you have the prices that are being called out, but as you can see on the second column, some of the prices are recorded outside of the column. Those are all the prices that are being called out in the auction, but that the clerk knows are bought-ins from people who are buying back their own goods. So this is not, the public doesn't see this, it just sees that the clerk continues writing down the bids. You can see also some of the goods are being suppressed. Some of the names are the names of the buyers are actually the name of agents for other people. So the people calling out in the room are not the names that are being inscribed, because he knows who is being agent for other aristocrats or other collectors. So his role was therefore to maintain an information asymmetry and a lack of transparency in the room. At the end of the sale, he would do the sum with the whole amount, those that are actually sold and those that were bought in, which is something that wasn't apparent in the sale. And afterwards, he would have been in charge of drawing up the bills with the commissions and to whom the money actually was going to. So the clerk is an important target if you're talking about corruption and lack of transparency. His work takes place under cover of regulation and within, apparently, the bounds of legal frameworks. And this is the world of the middlemen and the record keepers who wield an immense power in the auction. So that's why here, of course, Pitt is seen as a transformation of that job. He's seen here exchanging for money the quill that will create the record of ownership for the buyer grasping the crown at the moment of revolutionary upheaval. One important thing in those satires is that it actually shows the artist's knowledge of how the auction room works. The fact that the clerk is given such a prominent role in those satires means that, for example, he's here represented, so you have a clerk on one side, a buyer on the other, And you can see that the clerk has a master catalogue, the catalogue that has all the information and the sheets that are added. Whereas the buyer here, an aristocratic buyer, you can see his lion head, he's only got the flimsy leaflet, the bare bone information that was available in the public catalogues, those leaflets that were distributed in coffee houses as advertisement. And if you look, so here you can see that the artist knew about this function, and if you look at the material evidence that is being left, that the extent material evidence from this time, those would have been the catalogues that you would hold in your hands as a bidder. You can see they're very flimsy, they're quite cheap, whereas on this side over there you have a clerk's master catalogue, and they're actually heavy booklets. And this is something that is hard to grasp nowadays, because a lot of those catalogues, sales catalogues, have been bound in the 19th century as collectibles for collectors, and it's quite rare to actually see them in the original state. So the last character is the porter. The porter as another one of those accomplices in the whole process. For example, here in the middle, you can see Queen Charlotte, who is an accomplice in the looting of the leftovers of the French Revolution, profiting from the refugees' wealth. Or you have here Sir Henry Dundas as the enabler, the accomplice of Pitt's government. Another satire, exactly the same setting again. You have Marshal Berthier, a prominent advisor of Napoleon in his campaigns, and he stands holding up a crown above his head to win over the Allies. This is a satire that happens in the wake of the Battle of Leipzig, or the Battle of Nations, and you can see all the Allies in front of the auctioneer, who is Napoleon, of course. So these position, porter, clerk, auctioneer, they pertain to the auction, but they also obey to the requirement of the satire genre. They have the required derivativeness. They enable a capacious scene with the whole audience. And also, of course, there's an instant recognition of the theme from the public of those satires, from the educated public of those satires. So these auction scenes made it possible to pack the scene. For example, the bidders on the right-hand side are all the European powers. They're combining references to the collapse of the Confederation of the Rhine, the liberation of Germany, the defeat of the French in Spain, the flight of Joseph, for example. And here in front you can see a Dutchman being held by a British sailor, and this is the liberation of Holland with British support. So you can really pack the scene of satire because you have so many characters that you can assemble. The other thing, of course, is also the lots, and all manners of lots can be transformed into auction lots. All manner of things, can be transformed into auction lots. For example, the trial papers of Queen Caroline, the Office of Justice, symbolized by a barrister's wig, or the naval procession, represented by framed maps that have become lots in an auction. The auction is very easy to transform into a world of words on paper. There's a profusion of paper being produced by this profession, the profession of the art market, from inventories, adverts, catalogues, and bills at the end of sale. So there's a highly recognizable vocabulary, things like going, going, gone in speech, of course, but also ready money, gentlemen, and all the paper headings, such as the catalogue of the collection of such and such by a gentleman, bankrupt, or leaving business. Also all the advertisements that are also very generic, now selling at auction at this place, all the valuable effects of so-and-so. So this enables the artist to bend so many events into an auction just by simply inserting them in the paper headings that are littered on the auction satire scene. So if we go back to the sort of chronology, we can see that at the beginning the satire on auctions are used for financial anxiety. There's a persistence of the satirical trope, precisely because there was a strong upper and upper middle class audience antagonism against the auctioneers and their perceived manipulation. There's a widespread anxiety about the dealings of those heritage mongers, as they're called, because these are also the people who are in charge of the after decease inventory, drawing up the inventories after decease. And this goes on for the whole century, the most complained about official corps in France in the Revolution's cahiers de doléances, the registers of grievances, were the auctioneers. And in Great Britain, this visual representation of the auction is consistent across the three periods I've selected. But to go back to the earlier one, this is a time of the first auctions at the beginning of the century, and they're very much bargain sales at the time. The cultural goods auctions are struggling at the beginning of the century to differentiate themselves from the Kendal sales or the mining sales, which come from the Dutch system, which most of the time dealt in wholesale or port office clearances. They're also most of the time happening around circumstances such as decease, bankruptcy, leaving trade, stock of trade, etc. So the upsurge of auctions from the 1680s to the 1720s happen in this sort of dodgy, disreputable atmosphere. And historians have puzzled over the reason for such a clear upsurge in that period. First, they try to find legal or structural reasons for them. It now seems to be settled that the surge happened because of the enormous influx of money that had no investment outlet in this proto-capitalist society. So that's why it was quickly associated with all the other money-making schemes. As early as 1695, so as the auction fever started gripping London, all this repetitive vocabulary, the auction-specific language, was already being picked up by satirists in writing first. So this is a catalogue of ladies to be sold at auction, and you can see that the whole catalogue is built on auction-specific vocabulary, like reserve prices, condition of sales described, all things that were vocabulary that was very, very new in London. Things like where the catalogue can be had, when the viewing days were happening, all the admission rules to get into those viewing days, but also things that were really specific to the cultural goods sales, things like the fact that paintings were often at that period sold as companions, so you could put them on both sides of your chimney, so you had companion pieces. And here again you have sisters being sold, so adapted to this sexist themes. So the advice given to the ladies is to come forward to be, I quote, set to sale the next auction day, otherwise they run the hazard of being shut out, for the commodity throng is upon us, and the auction is supposed to continue till all these sorts of movable be disposed of. So the vocabulary for these sales becomes interchangeable with other sales with doubtful or disreputable origins. And this idea of a commodity throng is reminiscent of the consumption surge of the 1690s to 20s. It also reminds us that pricing hard-to-price objects was seen as a potential for swindling situations. It's important to remember also that the first auctions were the world of brokers from Exchange Alley coffee houses. They were happening under the arcades of the Royal Exchange, exactly the same setting as Hogarth's South Sea Bubble satire, where, as you can see on the right-hand side, honest trade was left destitute. So these early auction satires are often emblematic. The auctioneer is often transformed into a devil fox, and importantly, there's often a swarm of monkey attendants representing all those middlemen that are springing up in this new art market. They are the ones that are upsetting the traditional trade of artistic patronage, which normally went from the artist directly to the patron. You can see here on that other side, the monkeys are cutting the throat of the artist, while a wolf is picking the pockets of the lion noble patron on the other side. So the interpretative text at the bottom edge of the plate mark reads, an auction is a public sale that injures those who fairly deal, while South Sea Indian Company are naught but mere monopolies, that like a certain corporation, and that is the charitable corporation, it was a corporation that was under suspicion for its for-profit model, and which imploded in 1731 in ways reminiscent also of the South Sea bubble. So a certain corporation first bite the poor, then gull the nation. Thus fraud and insincerity reign more or less in each degree. One of the reasons for the downfall of the charitable corporation, which is inserted in the satire here, was that they became the target of merchants, of merchant rage, accusing them of undercutting the traders by their sale of unredeemed goods. So the same accusation was being leveled at auction at the time, and especially picture auction, as I've shown you with the artist and the patron. What is at stake here is not the rejection of commerce, but the suspicion of speculation and the dismay in front of a faster pace of market powered by the Whig emerging stock market. As the auction was still a relatively new phenomenon up until the 1720s, it was used to discuss how financial risk could be hardly distinguishable from financial malfeasance. And at a time, especially when all kinds of schemes were being launched to try to make credit facilities more effective. So the audience of those early satire were also acutely aware of the interconnectedness of individual in the early modern market, in the early modern economy, that was dependent on socially embedded credit, on interpersonal relationship. Whereas the auction, as you can see here, sorry, the image again, the details are not so good, relied on the idea that you had to pay ready money within a very short period of time right after the auction. And so this is a modernity that was striking to the people at the time. The fact that you had to deal with anonymous cash with extremely rapid turnover of payments, which is in fact a practice historians normally associate with the spread of capitalism. You can see this in Mildew's economy of obligation, for example, in this particular context. So the danger of the marketplace where wholesale dealers could be embedded in the sale but not made public was one of the worries of people going to auction, because a lot of those auctions, although they appeared with the seller's name on the catalogue, had a lot of objects that would be just being the sales were being fleshed out by dealers and wholesale traders' goods. So for the public, this was reminiscent of the world of stock jobbers and brokers. To answer the criticism of the auctioneers tightened the rules with conditions of sales, with sales that became extremely regulated and always running on the same profile, although there were many auction houses in London. But no amount of conditions of sales, of incremental bids, of regulated commissions, and all the other internal regulation that sprang up at the time seemed to have rid the profession of these suspicions. Just like many accused the charitable corporation of being what they called a corporate pawnbroker, the auction was accused of the same thing, and that's why it was such a fertile ground to be used in satire. The debate at the time was raging on how actually pawnbrokers were supposed to be treated, were they supposed to be made illegal. What happened is that they were regulated and licensed by 1746 with an Act for the Better Regulation of Pawnbrokers, and that sort of stopped the flow of satires on this idea of the secondary market, the resale market. Just check the time. I'll just skip this. The second period is one of political anxiety as more upscale auction houses started springing up in London, such as Lay, which is the ancestor of Sotheby's, and Christie's, the mainly political satires started appealing to a public that was conflicted by the intersection of modern state and the marketplace. Especially as these auctions were generated for all sorts of good, going for cheap, and often dealt with a backlog of imports after war trade blockades. John Richard Moores, who's a specialist of representation in France, of France in English satirical prints, he reminds us that the political satires had a relative freedom from censorship and from suppression, which meant that they had the potential to say things that could not be said elsewhere. But it does not mean that this translated in a greater freedom of creativity and invention. You can see that the themes still appear very, very similar to what was at the beginning of the century. Because in a way, it was actually in the artist's interest to answer very quickly to a topical political scandal. Time was of the essence for parliamentary gossip, for example. You had to have a fast turnover because it was pushed by newspapers, the multiplication of genres such as ballads, pamphlets, squibs, readers' letters, that sprang up in this accelerated news cycle. So, for example, this series on Napoleon by Mary Darley benefited from using a setting that was malleable, that was readily adaptable, and that was also quite transparent, because she produced an avalanche of Napoleonic satires on the 1756, of auction satires in the 1756 military defeats, for example. So she always used the same setting, just changing the names on the headings of the catalogues, for example. And those satires became extremely reproducible forms. It's also an important part of the recycle and reuse technology of satires, even if we're not talking about recutting or pirate copies of designs. You still have, even in original copies, the idea that you recycle and reuse the technologies and the designs. The genericity of those satires was often useful to transfer with minimum adaptation some portrait charge, some denunciatory portraits from other scenes. So, for example, here we see this mock auction that I've already presented to you. If you look at the character, for example, of the King of Württemberg at the end there in purple, he transfers quite easily from an earlier satire. He's over there, as you can see. This is the same position of the crown. Everything is just transferred into just a new setting, because this was a handy shortcut for a very fast-paced production. Mock auction is actually produced on December 25th, 1813, whereas Friend and Foes is produced on December 12, 1813, and it comes on the heels of the Rhenish Confederacy 2 days before. This one is set in an alchemist's den, and then it's hot on the heels of another one, Funking the Corsican, December 6th. This one is set in a coffee house, and you find again the same characters. And then there was also the Corsican Toad. This one is set in a torture room. It's published on November 27, and they're all using the same stage outline, with Napoleon surrounded by the powers of Europe. So Okay. By the end of the century, the satires become very much self-referential. They are actually satirizing the art market per se. And in the golden age of satire, those humorous prints have enormous economic success. They've superseded the traditional emblematic, those animal figures, or the hieroglyphical prints, which are intricate, which are complicated, which often had a longer shelf life that justified technologies such as cross-hatching or etching. Here you have simpler technologies, increasingly mediated by colored prints. And this suited the auction scene, which had become a fast-paced social event, attracting an ever-growing crowd because the auctions had become a little bit more exclusive, happening in the area of St. James and Pall Mall. As you can see, some of the viewing days became exclusive. You had to have a ticket to get into the Christie's auction, some of the viewing days at auctions, for example, here. The auctions had gained a bit more social acceptance. They had started sharing their great rooms with things like with institutions like the Royal Academy and the flurry of artistic shows by the end of the century. So they had acquired a certain respectability. The satires continued, although to treat them as episodes of swindles. What is not easily captured by modern audiences, 21st or 20th century audiences who are accustomed to the splash of record-breaking prices for contemporary art and record-breaking online auction, is that the auction was still, at the end of the century, although it had become a bit more respectable, it had become a sociability event, there was still bargain-oriented market, where you had undercutting, where you had information asymmetry, and where a sizable quantity of the goods were rather average than masterpieces. And so the satires continued to satirize both the audience but also the auctioneer. Here both are pictured as having, connoisseur glasses, but unable to see properly that the picture is actually upside down, and they're all bidding for something they clearly cannot understand and see properly. So who is the audience of those satires by the end of the 18th century? It's not a reflection of, well, at least it's not a straightforward reflection of middle class or middling sort values. Those satires cannot be used as a guide to Georgian morals, despite a long historiography that has asserted that caricature, and for example, caricature watching in picture sellers' window was a communal experience. Clearly not in the case of those satires. What we see here is, and a lot of people talking about satires and writing on satires have moved away from the idea that satire was popular. We can see that the complexity for us is not just because we do not have the topical knowledge to uncover the references. The essential mechanism of such satires, especially those on the art market at the end of the 18th century, is that they are to be read by those who are in the know, those who know more than the wrong-footed connoisseurs that are presented here. They rest on the fact that the mechanism of the auction would have been familiar to a certain set of consumers on the London market who were only too happy to underline that those lots were far from reaching their connoisseurial standard and that they could navigate the auction world much better than the people satirized. So it's also important to stress that the satires on the resale market, so the secondary market, came most of the time from artists who themselves were unmeshed. So the artists would have been on the primary market, but they were also most of the time unmeshed in the secondary market. For example, Darley's husband and co-creator was an upholder, which is a baser form of auctioneer. Humphrey's brother and financial partner was an agent for portrait collections and a picture restorer himself. So those would have been people who were very, very familiar with the world of the auction. So it's very difficult to answer the question, how damaged was the art market's reputation, its reputation of commercial fairness, just by using those satires. But what we can see is that by the end of the century, these satires that had become self-referential show that suspicion wasn't actually quite warranted. If you look at the importance of the clerks, the evidence of the documents about real auctions, the real extant documents about auction, show actually a massive amount of paperwork and of safeguards that went into the preparation of the auction. And so here you have a satire of Phillips, the auctioneer Phillips, from this kind of naive settings where you can be easily taken in. Both auctioneers on one side and collectors on the other side produced an enormous amount of records and worked on, gathering as much information as possible. And you can recreate this world, that it goes much further than just a moment of sale where you could have this kind of dramatic, theatrical event where you could be taken in. Here I've made, I'll explain this one. I've made a complicated slide about the paper trail of an auction sale. This is James Barry, the artist, auction sale, a sale of pictures and prints. And you can see that it starts from the inventory all the way to further than just the selling, but also the paying to the heirs. And Felton and Ortson have just written in 2020 an interesting volume about the bureaucracy of knowledge, and they call for historians to look a bit more closely at the thickness of bureaucratic knowledge, to recognize how all this knowledge is shaped by those practices, by the scribal practices, how rules about ownership and accountability would shape knowledge, and here the valuation of those artifacts, through acts such as inventorying, transferring, renovating, selling, buying, retaining, dispersing the heritage, etc. And so they underline that the knowledge system that these practices created should move us away from the hierarchy of knowledge that was that has been produced by art history at the time, and we should look at who actually knew and who was working on this knowledge at the time, to sort of follow loosely Lorraine Daston. So you can see here that you have papers first showing that the auctioneer goes to the studio of James Barry to do the inventory of the collection, then spends a month tracking some of the pictures or prints that are present in the will but not present in the studio, then have them certified by the family solicitor and making them check that everything from the will or from the knowledge of the nieces, nephews and uncles is present in the inventory. The goods are then sent to be cleaned, restretched, then they're sent to be framed so that they can be presented properly. Once this is done, a catalogue is produced. Here again, there's a back and forth between the family solicitor and Christie's about what is to be included in the catalogue and what order. So everything is always safeguarded and checked. Then you can see that the auctioneer and the auction house actually acts as a bank for the sellers, so the nieces and nephews of James Barry, so that they can already start paying the death duties, start sharing the money between themselves if some of the people actually need the money urgently. They also arrange for a delay of the sale because one of the family members attacks them in justice, and so the sale has to be delayed for 6 months. So there are again back and forth between the family solicitor, Christie's, and the warehouses. Then the advertisement of the sale has to be done. Again, it has to be approved by the solicitor and the family. The viewing days are arranged with tickets being sent to some of the family members and other people who are recommended, or sent also to the Royal Academy so that, puff can be done around the sale. And that's only then that the actual sale that you see on the Satire actually happens. And with this sort of thickness of the bureaucracy, you understand that the fast-paced moment of the sale, where you can have this sort of puff moment, is actually preceded by a lot of preparation, and it's a much longer process. And then you have another 3 months about paying the commissions, taking back whatever was given by the auction house that has transformed into a bank, etc., etc. Okay, so it's a very long process of nearly a year and a half between the inventory and the final payments. So now that we've seen the amount of work that went into the preparation of the sale on the side of the auctioneer, it's also important to see that a lot of the collectors were not going into the auction sale and just being surprised by the lots and taken over and with the idea that they could be scammed. Most of the collectors, and that's the sales catalogues that have reached us, are covered with annotations. Sorry. Sorry. This is still a production by the auctioneer. I just wanted to show you how the inventory would happen. Most of the time, the inventory would be done at the houses, and then after transport, you would have a change in the inventory between the categories of goods so that they can price them, and then the order of sale, which changes because then they reorganize the sale to make it a publicly pleasing sale with incremental bids, with always the masterpieces sold at the end and the lesser pieces at the beginning. So you can see that actually there was a lot of knowledge, there was a lot of art history knowledge that was going into first the inventory and then the sale, and there are two different orders that the auctioneer would master. Sorry. So this is what art market specialists are more attuned to, which are the catalogues annotated by collectors. And you can see here again, there's a long duration, there's a thickness of the annotation that goes. Most of the time you have the annotation here. It's nice to see because it's two different pens, two different hands. You have first the annotation that are taken down during the viewing days. So here it's the Horace Walpole's copy. His notes are taken during the viewing days. And so you have comments, you have indication of the bids that he would probably go for, the bids that he recommends, some information that he has from provenance or the amount that has been paid before. So he's taking down all this evidence. And then on the other side, you have, in the hand of his secretary, Thomas Kirkard, you have the prices that are that have been paid during the auction, because he was the one going to auction for bidding, and some more information that he gathers from the crowd. For example, he's trained, and that's why he's Horace Walpole's secretary, he's trained in recognizing which person is being an agent for which collector, so that Horace Walpole can then pursue those aristocrat collectors to try to get the objects that have slipped away from his grasp during the auction, so that there's this whole tracking of prices, objects, and provenances that is happening all the time. So that's with these reading through those annotations, you understand why those catalogues became collectibles and people would keep them, although the sale and the lot numbers are ephemeris, they have no meaning afterwards. There's still this idea that the collectors were going in trying to track all this information that was not available to them. So basically what was happening is that you had all those collectors that were trying to fill in the gaps a little bit like in those satires so popular in the 18th century, where you had to recognize who was being satirized and who was being made fun of. the same thing in the catalogue. You're trying to recognize who's selling, who's buying, because a lot of it is unknown, a lot of the information is not available. So, sorry for the time. Contrary to the satires about the antiquarians, which showed them as unsociable, unscientific, isolated, the satire on auctions was directed towards an audience that was instead very well connected and that was informed on the fact that these auctions were a well-organized process, a system of sale that had taken strong roots in Great Britain and that had transformed the pedestrian Dutch auction, which left very little visual traces, and that became, in England, endlessly satirized. And it was enjoyed precisely because one was supposed to not be like the Lord Anglaise in this Italian picture dealer, humbugging my Lord Anglaise. This was the target of the satire in the end, the person that didn't have the information, that wasn't able to connect the dots in the sales catalogue, that would be scammed by the crooked dealers of Old Masters on this bride. And so the laugh precisely was for those who knew enough to turn it into their advantage and to get a fair deal through the auction. Thank you. Sorry, I think I've been a bit too long. Sorry.